Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Before I begin, if you haven't, how many of you have got a chance to see the exhibit so far? Okay. You have to, so it's all the people who are hiding in the back who have not been to the exhibit. You have to go and walk through the exhibit. It really is amazing. And over the course of this 4-year commemoration, I have been to my share of Civil War exhibits, both in the state of Connecticut, but also traveling around in other states. And it really is a first-rate exhibit. So if you haven't seen it, please go down and take a walk through it. So the American Civil War. I learned everything that I know about the American Civil War from Bob Larkin, from the 9th Irish Regiment. So I always have to call out the Irish. This commemoration, we were just talking a few minutes ago, the Civil War commemoration in the state of Connecticut. Of course, it's a national thing. It goes on in the North and the South. Both sides still, to some extent, view the war in different ways. If you go south, and you are taught in the school systems in the South, you come to call it, and you have to say it right. You can't simply say the War of Northern Aggression. That's far too New England. You have to do it with some attitude and with some twang, and it's got to be the War of Northern Aggression. So the way that the nation views the war, continues to view the war, can be quite different in many respects. But certainly for the commemoration that Connecticut has been involved in, we have learned more about Connecticut's involvement in the war and the many, many stories. There's dozens of different kinds of things that you can focus on when it comes to the state of Connecticut's involvement in the Civil War. But we have learned more about this state's role and what it did to support the war, to oppose the war, how the war impacted the citizens of Connecticut. We've learned more about these varying subjects than any time, literally any time in our state's history since the end of the Civil War. I've done a lot of study of the centennial commemoration of the American Civil War, the 100th year anniversary, and though the commission did quite a number of things, I'm happy to say our commission's done a lot more. We've really engaged this subject and looked at it from all of these varied points of view, and we've dug into it, and we've seen more research, more publications, more presentations, more symposia, more encampments. And what the great thing about it is really has been the commemoration has very much been a coming together of the reenactment and the living historian community along with the educational and academic community. And those two groups don't always necessarily play well together. They don't necessarily interact effectively. And one of the goals of this commemoration for us was to bring these two groups together, understanding that they sometimes focus on the history of the war in different ways, but that common interest can be to both of our benefits. To go to an encampment and see the sights, the sounds, the smells, the noises of what goes on in an encampment can really inspire people to want to then take that next step and study the Civil War in a more detailed way. They go to the encampment and they go, wow, this is so interesting. And then they go start picking up a book. Hopefully it's my book. But they go and start picking up a book and they start doing research and they start learning about this tremendous and at very oftentimes troubling history. We do not say that we are celebrating the American Civil War. I, for one, do not celebrate war. I think war is a bad thing. But we do commemorate wars, and that's a different thing. That's not saying, hurrah, look at this heroic war. It's saying, let's study this, let's figure out what happened, let's try and figure out how it happened, why it happened, what the ramifications of it are, how it impacted the lives of varying citizens. And one of the things that Peter and I were talking about earlier today before the talk was one of the ways that I really try and get across to people, and especially younger people, my students, the people of that age, is I ask them how their life has been impacted by 9/11 and how that has affected their outlook, how it has affected our nation, both in terms of our domestic issues, but also in terms of our standing and how we interact with others, nations in the world. And they have an immediate gut reaction to that because it's something that happened within the scope of their lifetime, and it's something that they almost have a visceral, emotional connection to. And this is one of the most difficult things to get at when you're studying history, and especially the history of politics or the history of war, is that we have a tendency to sort of study it in a box and think about it but not be able to touch it. And when you can have a touchstone that is emotional for them and then say, okay, the way that you feel about this, this is the way that previous generations felt. You think about how much 9/11 has impacted our nation. 3,000 people killed at the World Trade Center, another about 6,000 killed in the 10 years of war in the aftermath of that, when in fact only less than 1% of our nation has served in the military in these years. And now think about the American Civil War. What happened in 9/11 and in the years in the aftermath does not touch a single Civil War battle. Okay? In the Battle of Antietam, the single bloodiest day in American history, 23,000 men killed and wounded in 12 hours. Right? That's the impact of the American Civil War. Today's numbers, 750,000 people die in this war. This is both North and South. That is over 7 million people in today's population figures. That makes it pretty easy to understand why this war has such a tremendous, tremendous impact on how people see it. Less than 1% of our population today serves in the military. From Connecticut alone, 47% of the male population between the ages of 15 and 50 served in the Union Army. Okay? 47%. We've never seen that type of mobilization ever. Not in World War II. Right? This is massive. There is not a single person in the state of Connecticut who is not impacted by this war. And again, I told Peter, I'm fond of quoting John Niven, who wrote a book on Connecticut called Connecticut for the Union. He wrote it in 1865, or 1965. I will shoot back and forth centuries in a heartbeat, so you better pay attention. He wrote it in 1965 at the tail end of the commemoration, and he says in this that from the firing on Fort Sumter to the peace at Appomattox, Connecticut looked like an armed camp. There were constantly soldiers coming and going, whether they were preparing to go to war, whether they were returning from war, whether they were sent home because of illness or injury. There are aid societies that are constantly collecting materials for the troops who are out in the field, and I'll talk more about this as I go along, but I wanted to give you this little preface, just sort of this big picture of how much this war impacts people.